A lot of TF2's weapon design centers around the downsides given to weapons with powerful effects. The upsides are certainly important and define what a weapon can do, but it's the drawbacks to using these weapons in comparison to stock that really tightens TF2's balance. Okay, now what? Today's experiment asked the question, what if silly things like game balance didn't get in the way of our fun? Or more specifically, what on earth would happen if we flat out removed every negative stat in the game? This ended up being a very interesting experiment to do, so after a word from today's sponsor, I cannot wait to break it down. But first, a word from today's sponsor, Raycon. Raycon offers premium earbuds at a less than premium price. Their everyday earbuds are fantastic little doohickeys that now come with some awesome new features. On top of multi-point connectivity, they have an absurdly long 32-hour battery life, making them fantastic for daily use. My personal new favorite feature, though, is the active noise canceling, which filters out the ambient sound so you can only hear what you actually want to be listening to. Noise canceling in general is a fantastic feature, which is hard to find at a good price point, but Raycon's everyday earbuds start at half the price of the other premium audio brands. I usually walk around my neighborhood every day, and I enjoy listening to podcasts or random YouTube videos while doing so, and the active noise canceling from the Raycons does a very good job at filtering out the sounds of traffic. And on top of all of that, Raycon has my favorite feature available, which is needless customization, with a ton of colors available. I personally love the ones that I got them in blue with a cool galaxy print cover, and they've served me very well so far. If you want a pair of these yourself, you can go to buyraycon.com/greatblue to get up to 20% off site-wide. That's right, you get up to 20% off of everything on Raycon's website, including 20% off of all headphones too when you go to buyraycon.com/greatblue. There's no risk to trying them out either, because if you're not happy with them after 30 days, you can return them with no questions asked. They're definitely worth giving a try. Before I get into the experiment, I should probably answer the question that really shouldn't have to be answered but does anyway, and that is, what exactly counts as a negative stat? Surely it can't be that hard, just remove any stat that makes the weapon worse and call it a day, right? Well, let me ask you something, is this stat a downside? The weapon considers it to be so since it's written in red text, but minis are incredibly useful, costing less metal to build and having a faster turning speed. What about this stat on the Wrangler? If the sentry doesn't stay disabled, then it doesn't get to keep its shield. While the downtime sucks, the extra defense could definitely make your sentry live for longer if you need it to. Or what about this stat? Even though it's harmful on a surface level, it lets the beggars have insane mobility once you master it. There's clearly a lot of ambiguity if we don't have a system, so we're gonna have to set some hard and fast rules for the experiment. So here's how I'm deciding what to remove. If a stat's listed in red text in the weapon description, it's gone, no exceptions. Even if the red stat's technically a positive, we are removing it no matter what for the sake of consistency. Gray stats that are unambiguously negative will also be removed. However, if there is any uncertainty as to whether it helps or hurts the weapon, we're keeping it. Sometimes Valve writes clearly intended downsides in gray text for whatever reason, so hopefully this will cover the edge cases without being too overbearing. And finally, if a negative function is included in a line of blue text for whatever reason, it will not be removed from the weapon. There were a few reasons for this that mostly boil down to inconsistency if I didn't, so that's the way the dice have to fall. Additionally, and perhaps controversially, hidden downsides are not going to be touched in any way, shape, or form. The main reason for this is that a lot of hidden downsides exist indirectly because they're on a different weapon type than stock, and you may not think that matters, but let me give you an example of why it does. Take the instance of Huntsman arrows doing 20% less damage than rifle rounds, for example, in a head-to-head comparison. Most people would consider this a downside, and therefore the Huntsman should have a listed 20% damage penalty. However, as I mentioned, TF2 has the precedent of treating different weapon types separately when considering which numerical stats to list. So as far as the game is concerned, Huntsman arrows don't do 80% of the damage of a rifle bullet, they do 100% of the damage of a bow and arrow. It's just that by default, the bow and arrow weapon type has less base damage than the rifle weapon type does. And there are a lot of cases of this happening, so if we don't do it this way, we once again run into the scenarios that force us to make some very unintuitive changes. So even though that does leave a few minorly frustrating instances of untouched hidden stats, overall this is the fairest way to do things, and I'm pretty happy with the system. With all of that said, the next course of action was to get my hands on a working plugin and run it on a TF2 server for a while. And thanks to friend and server developer Muddy, seriously, this video would not have been possible without him, that is exactly what me and most of my community did. We played on mostly every game mode to get the full experience, and with one major exception, we kept the plugin mostly the same for the entire week, minus some bug fixes. And honestly, it was a ton of fun. When we started, though, as you may be able to expect, it was also absolute chaos. Every weapon in the game being super buffed at the same time leads to a rather overstimulating experience, so it took a while for everyone to get used to the changes. However, almost immediately we found what the best weapon in the game was, and it wasn't particularly close. If you played on the server day one, you know exactly what I'm talking about and still probably suffer from the PTSD. If you didn't, this one actually might surprise you because it's on a weapon that otherwise slips under the radar. So let me show you a clip from the first couple hours of the experiment, and I want to see if you can spot the problem with it. Okay, that was a hard one. Maybe you were eating dinner or playing Minecraft on your main monitor and didn't quite catch that, so let me show you another one. So as it turns out, per the rules that we established in the beginning, the bonk was the most broken weapon on planet Earth because of this single line of text being removed. Being able to attack while completely invincible effectively meant that Scout had an 8-second uber on a 22-second cooldown. When combined with the rest of his incredibly good weapons, the optimal strategy was to drink bonk, go on a massacre for 8 seconds completely unimpeded, and then wait 16 seconds to do it again. Outside of strategies that required the entire team to cooperate and stack sentries, there was basically no counter to this. And I think most people found this out pretty quickly, because for the entirety of the first day, this is what every single match looked like. Tidal waves of invincible scouts who would either eviscerate you with a torrent of bullets or rush you down at light speed with their melee. And again, outside of team-wide strategies, the literal only thing you could do about that was attempt to push them back as Pyro or just hope they shoot someone else instead. So as honest as we wanted to keep things, I figured it'd be a pretty lame experiment if everything was only judged on how well it could deny an invincible scout. With that in mind, we revised the plugin and added back the can attack while invulnerable stat for the sake of our sanity, but also a couple other reasons. I don't exactly feel bad doing this because A, this was the reaction on the server when it got nerfed. And B, we actually took a lot of creative liberties to make the original bonk work. The reason why scouts are ubered here is because the actual bonked effect is hard-coded not to let you attack. The way we worked around this was replacing the condition that was added when you drink it with one that uber charges you. And even though that allows for a more intuitive interpretation of how it would work if the stat was taken literally, you could also very well argue that applying the bonk status is what the weapon does. And replacing it with uber, while effective, makes it a brand new weapon entirely. Is that cope? Maybe, but after dealing with this bullshit for 18 hours straight, it's a cope that I and the rest of the server were more than willing to accept. So there's your answer. If taken completely literally, the bonk is the best weapon in the game, but without the bonk, what exactly happens? Well, with the bonk nerfed and some other miscellaneous bugs fixed, the experiment actually became super interesting and fun. I'd say the biggest difference to vanilla TF2 overall is that the average time to kill went significantly down across the board. And I mean, that makes sense. If you remove every single damage, clip size, and firing speed penalty in the game, you're bound to see some higher numbers. I was half expecting this to be offset with Medic, since all of his healing options would be theoretically buffed too. The problem is that the biggest downside of each medigun is the opportunity cost of not running a different one, so only like 3 total stats got removed from his entire kit. So as such, it was easier to both kill and be killed regardless of which class you played, which as you may expect had some cascading effects on the game. Overall though, while you could definitely feel the changes, especially if you were pushing in on offense, it wasn't unwinnable for either team by any means. And as far as class balance goes, despite the craziness, there wasn't any single class that felt more powerful than the rest despite certain weapons feeling very oppressive at times. I'm honestly very impressed at how well TF2's balance continues to hold up in extreme conditions like this. But the most interesting changes overall, and the ones that I'm sure most people are here to see, are the changes to the weapon meta. You mega buff every unlockable weapon in the game and make stock completely useless. Obviously that's going to make for a much different experience than vanilla. So because it's hard to quickly summarize the fallout of that, I think it's time we break each class down individually. There were a ton of super interesting loadouts created from this, and I cannot wait to talk about them. That said though, not every single weapon change was interesting enough to talk about. I don't think I need to summarize the changes to the game that the hot hand doing 20% more damage would cause. So for each class, I want to go through their standout weapons, talk about which ones I believe to be the best, and then rank everything else in a tier list. Sound good? Hope so, because that's what we're doing. As I mentioned in the beginning, Scout was the only class to get a significant change midway through in the form of the bonk being nerfed. I'll mainly be discussing his kit as it stood for the remainder of the week, but know that with the pre-nerf bonk, he was easily the most broken class in the game, and again, it really wasn't that close. Even without the on-command invincibility though, Scout still ends up being incredible. The 2 break-action scatterguns are contenders for the best weapons in the entire mod, since without the clip size penalty, you're able to kill any class in a single burst. Going in, I assume the Force of Nature would be the better of the 2, since without the damage penalty, it's able to one-shot meat-shot a light class. However, in practice, I found the Soda Popper to be consistently better, since even though you miss out on some raw damage, you're not knocking people out of your effective range. Combine that with the fact that you don't ruin your mid-air momentum, and it's a lot easier to connect all 6 shots in your clip for a ton of damage. The Babyface's blaster was the 3rd contender for best scattergun, even if I don't think it quite matches the power level of the other 2. Infinite Boost is broken, letting you stay at the game's literal movement speed cap for the entire match. The main downside of this though that the other 2 didn't face is that sentries are still able to kill you even if you're running at max speed. So as fun as moving at light speed around the map was, a single engineer still prevented you from playing the game. The best secondary is a little bit hard to judge, since as normal it usually depends on the map and team compositions. However, I'd say the best overall was the Winger, being a pistol with extra free damage and mobility. The healing from the pocket pistol was nice, but compared to a vertical jump boost, it wasn't as impactful in most situations in my opinion. Outside of that though, most people were either running the Criticola for even more damage on their primary, or the Mad Milk, because even though it didn't get changed at all, lifesteal is still really good. The funniest change for Scout though was his melee, because due to the insane damage some of these can deal now, it actually became became a viable means of combat. The best melee for damage was easily the Fan of War, because without the 75% damage penalty, it's just the bat that always crits. Running at people with full boost and WM1ing them with the Fan of War was a genuinely powerful tactic. Most classes just kind of die before they're able to retaliate. However, despite the damage, I personally believe Scout's best melee overall was the Candy Cane. Your primary is more than capable of close range combat, and the instant reload of the Soda Popper means you never really need a melee in lieu of reloading, so why not get free healing from every single kill while also being able to run a damaging secondary? So even though the competition was tight, I'll say Scout's best loadout in general was the Soda Popper, Winger or Criticola, and the Candy Cane. It does nearly everything you want, with the only downsides being the opportunity cost of niche utility. Overall, he was a very powerful class no matter what you decide to run though. Like Scout, Soldier ended up with a bonkers kit mostly thanks to his primaries. The competition though wasn't as tight, since I think the unarguably best weapon in Soldier's kit and also the second best in the entire game was the direct hit. The only stat that got removed was an explosion radius penalty, but oh my god, that single change was more than enough to catapult this thing into the upper echelons of the meta. It's a rocket launcher, already one of the best weapon types in the game, but with enough damage to insta-kill light classes, an undodgeable projectile, and the ability to mini-crit the enemies you juggle into the air, even with the splash damage that comes from shooting the ground. It just kinda does everything, and it does everything incredibly well at that. However, despite the direct hit being the winner, Soldier was not without his options, because he had two other broken primaries in the form of the Rocket Jumper and Beggar's Bazooka. The Rocket Jumper was a simple concept. It's identical to the stock rocket launcher, but you can't damage yourself with it at all. You can shoot people point blank and not be harmed by your own explosions, you can fly around the map for completely free, there's basically no risk to using this thing. Shouldn't be hard to imagine why that's extremely powerful. The Beggar's, on the other hand, was a bit less intuitive, because on the surface it looks like one of the few weapons in the game to get screwed over by the lack of a downside rather than helped. A very surprising amount of people think of overload jumping as an essential part of Beggar's gameplay, and without it you're stripped of your best means of mobility. And while sure, you can't go for the insane clips that have like a 1 in 50 chance of actually working, you still have a perfectly accurate spam fire rocket launcher that allows you to indefinitely hold 3 rockets in the chamber. This is a more than worthy trade-off, since you can vomit out endless projectiles or hold them to insta-kill the next poor sap who rounds the corner. The rest of the rocket launchers were good enough to get the job done, but there honestly wasn't much of a reason to use them instead of the 3 just mentioned. The direct hit's a better Liberty launcher, the Beggar's is a better airstrike, and while the black box is decent for healing, you can't really out-heal the insane damage nearly every class has access to now. His secondaries were boring, since he's a class that's designed around opportunity costs instead of red text, so everything that's good in vanilla TF2 is just as good here. If the Bison had its invisible downsides removed, it might be a bit better, but even then I couldn't really imagine running it over the banners considering how well they pair with your busted primaries. The best melee was a toss-up between the escape plan because free movement speed is always good, and the half Zatoichi because of a specific quirk in the game mode. For those wondering, we left random crits turned on for the entire experiment because a lot of melees are balanced around whether or not they can randomly crit. This has some very interesting implications as I'll get to later. As far as it concerns Soldier though, a melee with a longer range that heals you if you kill someone was very, very good and probably was the optimal choice. So with all of that said, my vote for the best Soldier loadout is the direct hit, Battalion's Backup, and half Zatoichi. You could realistically swap out the secondary for whichever banner you wanted, but Bats was just really good at offsetting the overall lower time to kill. Pyro was unfortunately a weaker class despite the rather unfortunate tools he has access to. What do I mean by unfortunate tools? Yep, that was the best primary and secondary by far, and it wasn't really close. The dreaded Scorch Shot Flog combo was stupid, letting Scorch Shot flares actually kill a light class in one hit like many people assume that it can in vanilla, and it forces soldiers and demos to eat their own crit projectiles if they try to stop an oomph push. The Dragon's Fury was the only other flamethrower that was even kinda worth using, because without the air blast penalty it actually works like it's supposed to. But even despite the insane damage you get with this thing, it just can't compete with oomph. As far as secondaries go, the Panic Attack was the other really good one for Pyro at least, being a shotgun that does really good damage up close thanks to the extra pellets and faster deploy speed. If it weren't for the fact that the Scorch Shot can now do full distance jumps, I'd honestly say the insane damage this thing outputs would be better. The best melee was still probably the Power Jack because of the movement speed, but the Back Scratcher did provide some good utility, and the Extinguisher did a ton of damage if you could actually land the hit. Unfortunately though, even with all of this at his disposal, Pyro just wasn't as good as most of the rest of the classes. Flog pushes were incredible, sure, especially when paired with the medic, but outside of that, you're almost entirely relying on Scorch Shot flares to do most of your damage. And the damage was solid, don't get me wrong, but it's going up against things that either do better damage at the same range or can just close the gap and out DPS your Flog assuming you don't have the crits active. Still a very usable class that contributes to his team, but unfortunately nowhere near the most powerful. If you want a class who's broken by every conceivable metric, look no further than Demoman. Demo has access to some insane weapons now, and in my opinion just barely beats Soldier and Scout for the most powerful class in the mod. The best primary was easily the lock and load, since it's just a stock grenade launcher with faster projectiles and more building damage. Having to hit projectiles is one of the biggest weaknesses of stock, so having faster pipes without sacrificing rollers is frankly insane. Brief aside, I also want to show you how cursed the lock and load looks with rollers, just in case you haven't seen it yet. Because they don't have any tumble coming out of the launcher, all the grenades just slide across the floor like penguins. It's honestly amazing to look at. Demo's best secondary is one that honestly took me by surprise at first, but upon thinking about it a little bit more, it makes complete sense. The item that is not only Demoman's best weapon, but in my opinion, the best weapon in the entire mod, even beating the direct hit when considering the class's entire kit, is the Quickie Bomb launcher. With no downsides, the Quickie Bomb may very well be, and I say this without exaggeration, the perfect TF2 weapon. The stock Sticky Bomb launcher is already the best weapon in vanilla, but it does come with its weaknesses. Notably, there's a delay on how fast you can detonate, making close range combat a bit tough for it, and the relatively long charge time leaves a bit to be desired for chipping enemies at longer ranges. The Quickie Bomb not only removes both of those two weaknesses, but it also gives you up to 180 damage per sticky if you're able to charge it. That is absurd to the point a lot of other broken weapons don't even come close to. Like the direct hit, this thing does literally everything, but it also has the utility of insane movement and sticky trapping. However, unlike the lock and load, the Quickie Bomb actually had some competition. The sticky jumper was the same deal as the rocket jumper, letting you have normal sticky damage and mobility without the drawback of the health loss. This had the potential to be absolutely crazy, letting you sticky jump all the way across the map to the enemy's spawn and then spawn camp them with the exact same weapon. Due to how easy it was for demos doing this to get into position, there was a good chance you just instantly die coming out of spawn on a lot of Koth maps. So even though I think the faster operating speed of the Quickie is generally better, the sticky jumper's insane mobility made it a very competitive choice. But the final and probably funniest part of Demo's kit were his swords. You know how earlier I mentioned that every single melee weapon in the game can randomly crit now? Well, not only are the swords included in this, but they also have their slower weapon switch speed completely removed too. This means that you can run swords on explosive Demo, who's meant to be weak at close range, and then immediately have better close range capability than most classes in the game. I'd say the strictly best sword was the half Satoichi, since like Soldier, the times you're going for melees are also the times you're going to want health if you win. However, I preferred running the Eyelander, since on top of getting a free permanent stat buff if you find an out-of-position enemy, it also farms heads very quickly off of the Dead Ringer. I'll talk about why that's significant later, but for now just know that it means you can always have max heads if you encounter a Dead Ringing spy. So in summary, if you're running this loadout, you can play a version of Demoman that excels at every range, does way more damage than every class in the game at most of those ranges, and can get up to 235 health and scout level movement speed without much trouble at all. Now, was Demo completely broken to the point of overshadowing every other class? No, not really. But he was undeniably the best class in the experiment, and honestly probably still would be if he didn't have a grenade launcher. Which, oh yeah, speaking of, we should probably talk about the Demo Knight-shaped elephant in the room. So even though swords can randomly crit now, Demo Knight was pretty bad, honestly. He could occasionally get some telekinetic random crit kills, but on top of most classes being able to absolutely crush him, as well as the opportunity cost being the literal best weapon in the game, it ended up being more of a gimmick than anything serious. It was a fun gimmick, sure, but it definitely wasn't optimal if you were trying to win. So yeah, Demoman OP, Demo Knight kinda mid, not much else to add. Heavy is another class that had a very obviously best loadout with minimal competition. But unlike Pyro, the weapons that made Heavy completely insane absolutely suck in the main game. You got the Brass Beast, which operates at normal minigun speed, which has a free damage bonus and resistance. And then you have the Buffalo Stake, which like the Bonk Atomic Punch has one very, very important stat removed. If you eat this thing, you're no longer restricted to melee, but you still get the mini crits. If you use these together, you become a speed boosted Heavy with an over 50% damage bonus and no damage fall off. This ended up being, as some of my sharper viewers may have guessed, broken as fuck. It was easily the most common loadout I found on the server, since if pocketed by a medic, it took a very dedicated effort to take one of these down. But even though the damage was good, I think the main draw came from the ease of use, because at its core, this combo doesn't exactly fix the problems Heavy has in normal TF2. You were a bit faster, sure, but you still weren't fast. And you still have to have direct line of sight of the person you're shooting. You can't shoot around corners or over obstacles like Demo can. And since the Buffalo Stake's damage vulnerability is a hidden stat and thus wasn't removed, it canceled out the damage resistance you got from staying revved. So yeah, Heavy dealt a lot of damage, but unlike Soldier and Demo, his weaknesses were still a big issue. He did have access to other solid weapons too, though. The Natasha was just annoying to play against as you'd think, the Fists of Steel and Gloves of Running Urgently both had their normal utility with no drawbacks, and the Eviction Notice did insane melee damage to anyone you could get into range of. But the reason most people picked Heavy was because of the Brass Beast, Buffalo Stake, and probably Gru. Nothing else really even came close. Engineer surprisingly ended up being one of the tamest classes in the mod, because while he does have access to some nasty stuff, none of it really approaches game-breaking territory. For primaries, he has the Rescue Ranger, which has 6 shots and repairs buildings for free, making keeping his sentry up a lot easier. And the one that I personally believe to be the best, the Frontier Justice, mainly because of a single stat that really shouldn't even have been listed in the first place. Unlike the rest of the crit-storing weapons, the Frontier Justice specifically tells you that it loses crits between lives. For the record, every single crit-storing weapon works like this, so I'm not sure why the Frontier Justice had to list it separately, but without that stat, you do keep your crits until you shoot them. Doesn't matter if you die with them, doesn't even matter if your sentry goes down when you're already dead, you will still get the crits. Assuming you're playing Engineer somewhat well, this usually leads to you having a permanently crit-boosted shotgun, which as you might expect is rather powerful. I do also feel compelled to mention the bug this thing had for a bit because it was really funny. Somehow instead of transferring crits just between lives, it transferred them between everything. You could disconnect and rejoin, switch teams, switch classes, even switch maps, and you'd still keep the crits. We obviously fixed that pretty quickly because what the hell, but it was probably the funniest bug to come out of the plugin at least. The other primary I know I'll get asked about a lot is the Widowmaker, because in theory this would allow you to have infinite metal. However, if you look at the actual wording on the stats, the upside is that damage dealt is returned as ammo. And by default, ammo isn't metal. The thing that forces the Widowmaker to use metal as ammo is listed in red text and therefore isn't on the weapon anymore. The way it actually works is that it's a bottomless clip shotgun, which as you might expect is still super solid, but unfortunately it is not the game-breaking menace a lot of people assumed it would be. Engineer's best secondary you'd think would be the short circuit, since in theory it'd be free, but unfortunately only the shitty primary fire is free. The alt fire has its metal cost listed in blue text, so it didn't get removed. Overall, I think the Wrangler ended up being the better choice by far, since even though it didn't get changed at all, the Wrangler's just still really, really good. The best melee was interesting, because going in I assumed the Gunslinger would be completely OP, but it was honestly pretty close. It does give you 150 max health and lets you get a level 1 sentry up nearly instantly, but in comparison it's a lot slower to upgrade and repair than the Jag. So the meta ended up being the Gunslinger if you needed immediate defense or were playing aggressive, and then switching to the Jag to maintain the building once it's up. Really just a more extreme version of the current Jag and a stock meta that exists in current TF2. Pretty neat. Overall though, Engineer's best loadout was very situationally dependent, but I'd say in most situations it was the Frontier Justice, Wrangler, and either Gunslinger or Jag. Engineer just wasn't an amazing class outside of extreme cases like Barn Blitz last. He got hella buffed, sure, but the meta weapons for the other best classes could both destroy a level 3 building nearly instantly. So unless you were constantly babysitting your sentry with the Wrangler, you couldn't really get much use out of Engineer without a lot of team support. If I had to pick a class that was changed the least without their downsides, I'd probably give that title to Medic. Now that doesn't mean that Medic was a bad class, in fact he was far from it. It's just that in comparison to Vanilla, he got the least amount of improvement to his kit from his downsides being erased. And most of that comes down to the familiar situation of Medic being balanced around opportunity cost instead of red text. Not getting Uber from melee hits does suck, but it's not like removing the 10 max health penalty on the Vitasaw makes that suck any less. So because of that, Medic still was an ever-present support because he supported the good classes very well, but most of his weapons remained exactly the same. With one very funny exception that I'd be remiss not to mention. The Crusader's crossbow proudly tells you that it's unable to headshot. Why? Well, back when the crossbow was first released, the projectile it fired was visually identical to Huntsman arrows. So Valve thought it necessary to clarify that crossbow arrows don't share the Huntsman's ability to headshot. This was a pretty useful stat to have until the projectile model was changed to a big syringe in 2013, but for whatever reason, the downside's still listed, and according to the rules, that penalty's gotta go. So yeah, the crossbow can just dome people for up to 225 now. For reasons that were better explained than my what if every weapon could headshot experiment, this didn't change as much as you'd think, mostly due to projectile hitbox shenanigans. But at the very least, it did give skilled medics an easy way to defend themselves and occasionally delete people from blind firing across the map, so that was fun, I suppose. I'd say the biggest change to medics weapon meta, though, is that all 4 mediguns were equally as viable now. Stock and crits didn't get any changes, but there's still fantastic support for the classes that did. And the quick fix being able to give max overheal and the vaccinator being great against explosive stacking both solidified their use too. But yeah, outside of those minor changes, medic unfortunately did not get any playstyle overhauls. Still a great class by nature of Uber and him being the game's only healer, but not much to talk about in an experiment like this. Sniper was another class that was decent all around, but had a very clearly defined best weapon that carried most of his gameplay. Most people that I talked to assumed that weapon would be the Sydney Sleeper, because with the ability to headshot, it's basically just a faster charging stock that also applies a debuff. And while yeah, the Sydney Sleeper was really good, there was ironically a sleeper pick that was even better, and that was the Classic. This thing was bonkers, being by far the most versatile rifle in the entire game. You could instantly quickscope someone right in front of you without actually having to scope, making what's normally a highly precise move practically free if you're decent at aiming. You could hardscope scope without the move speed penalty or red dot, giving you a massive advantage in sniper duels. And you basically had a permanent heatmaker focus effect since you didn't have to unscope between shots. The literal only downside of the classic was that its tracer rounds are a hidden stat, so occasionally it was easier to point out a classic sniper if they missed. But considering you were a lot more resistant to being flanked and getting flinched while scoped, oftentimes that barely mattered. The only other ones that I consider even slightly worth using are the Bizarre Bargain, since it has a faster max charging speed than even the Sleeper with max heads, and the Machina for the sole reason that it's the only rifle able to one-shot, headshot, or revved brass beast heavy. His secondaries are boring since they're another set of opportunity cost weapons, and the only real improvement is that the Cleaner's Carbine was now a stock SMG with Crikey. This made it his best secondary for self-defense, but it was honestly still contested by the Girardi. And stemming from that, his best melee was the Bushwhacker, because it doesn't matter if you're using the Girardi or Crikey, you still get the guaranteed crits either way. Once again, a very consistent but fairly boring class to talk about due to the clearly defined meta. And last but assumedly not least, Spy was certainly something in this. For revolvers, I'd say the best choice was the Ambassador, which now did full 120 damage crits for most ranges. I say most ranges because there is an additional hidden stat that makes headshots not crit at all past certain ranges rather than just having the damage fall off. But even though you couldn't snipe people from across the map like the good old days, this was still Spy's best damage dealer by far. The knives were a lot more competitive, with nearly all of them having a legitimately good use case. The Big Earner without the health penalty was the best for mobility, the Year without the cloak drain was an absolute menace for chain stabbing, and the Spycicle made you completely immune to Pyro as long as you had it out, since it still made you fireproof but never actually melted. However, as you can probably guess, the most generally powerful knife was none other than the kunai. Removing the base health penalty not only makes you a lot less vulnerable before you get a stab, but it also raises the max amount of overheal you can get to disgusting amounts. The way the game calculates your overheal cap is just 3 times your max health, which a normal TF2 is a respectable 210. But in this mod, it's a whopping 375, which lets you survive practically indefinitely as long as you keep getting stabs. However, I think the main problem with that was not necessarily the kunai, even though it was extremely good. There was one more weapon that Spy had access to that was so incredibly stupid it made him impossible to kill if he was trying not to die. And that is, of course, all thanks to the Deadringer. The Deadringer has 2 separate downsides that normally exist to prevent the thing from being spammed. You can't get cloak from ammo boxes, and your meter drains to half the moment that it's activated. Without the Deadringer having these downsides, you can do this. What the hell? All you had to do as Spy is mash right click as soon as your Deadringer activated, and there wasn't a single thing anyone could do to kill you. You'd resist 80% damage from every attack, you'd have a permanent speed boost, and you still have the kunai to get yourself back up to stupid amounts of overheal if you ever started to get low. But if you wanted to be stealthy, you could also just wait forever to decloak, since without the initial cloak drain, you just have a double-length Deadringer. Doesn't even come with the downside of a long recharge if you choose to use it this way, since you can just decloak over an ammo box and immediately have it all back. I'm confident in saying that the Deadringer was one of the best weapons in the entire game, only beaten out by the direct hit and quickie bomb launcher due to their versatility. You could lead people on wild goose chases away from the objective. You could tank projectiles in front of a soldier or demo to make them kill themselves faster than they can kill you. You could really do whatever you wanted without dying. The only weakness to the Deadringer is that head farming weapons like the Eyelander rack up heads super quickly if you're spamming, so you did have to keep your distance from demos if you didn't want to screw over your team. But unless he's running full demo night, thus being weak to most of your team to begin with, you barely even had to worry about that. Funnily enough though, even with the broken Deadringer, I still don't think Spy himself was among the most powerful classes. It's not that he was bad, he was just outclassed by Scout and Sniper in the pick department since he does still rely on player ignorance to get kills. He was very, very annoying to play against, but most of the time he was not hard to keep away from your team even if you couldn't outright kill him. But yeah, that's what would happen if you stripped every TF2 weapon of its downsides. The other question that I think is very important to answer in an experiment like this is, was playing TF2 without downsides any fun? And I'd say yeah, absolutely it was. It sure as hell wasn't balanced, but playing with the busted weapons was a blast. The last thing that I'll mention before I go is that the experiment technically wasn't perfect due to how many things are hard-coded in TF2. So if there's a specific stat that you're wondering why we didn't change, chances are it's because it was either impossible or extremely tedious to do. Now, because I know I'll get asked, I unfortunately don't have have plans to run this on a server long term. The server that I use to test this is one that I share with several friends, and unfortunately they need to make use of it too, so I can't just keep running the no downsides mod forever. And while I've considered getting my own servers, they ain't cheap, and based on how few people played the experiment while it was active, I highly doubt it would be a worthwhile investment. That said though, if there's enough interest, I could be swayed into changing my mind. If you want to join the next organized play session, I'll announce it on my Discord server when it happens, link is in the description. And also, as always, thanks again to Raycon for sponsoring the video. It goes a long way into supporting the channel. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like. If you hated this video, that's technically a downside, so unfortunately I've got to remove you, and most importantly, have a good one.